Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. Indonesia is gearing up to host its annual Super Garuda Shield exercises. This year, countries participating include the US, Japan, Australia, South Korea, India, Singapore, Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam and Canada. China and Russia will not participate. Ahead of those drills, the US's F-22 fighter jet made a historic tour, flying over 3 South China Sea nations, Indonesia, Brunei and the Philippines, and landing in Indonesia and Brunei for the first time. How does this activity add to arguably the most contested region of the world? And what does it tell us about the ties Indonesia and Brunei have with the US and how they balance relations with China? Joining us today are Tony Hu, former US Department of Defense Senior Director for China, Taiwan and Mongolia, and Brian Hioe, New Bloom magazine founding editor. A very warm welcome to both of you on the show today. First, Tony, what do we know about this year's exercises?
Well, Garuda Shield exercise actually started in 2007. It was a bilateral Army-only exercise when it got started. It was between Indonesian Army and the U.S. Army Pacific. Now this year, as you said, 17 countries, and it's called Super Garuda Shield. The exercise itself involves taking advantage of Indonesia's vast jungle for land warfare, and it actually practice combat operations and live fires. And so it also has a second element, which involves civic affairs, where the forces go out there and they build schools, build roads. They use both the combat and civic affairs activities to improve interoperability amongst all the participants.
Right, right. And so the question there, Tony, would be, what is this interoperability for?
I think it's important to respond to contingencies. I think Indonesia certainly wants to prepare itself to be a part of a coalition in case there's instability around the world, and Indonesia wants to be a part of that player. I think that's why they opened up the country and allowed the Garuda Shield to expand to such an international versus a bilateral exercise.
Brian, let's bring you in. So, the press release from Indonesia was careful to say that these exercises are not targeted to Russia and China, although those countries are not participating. Can you tell us about, this geostrategicness of Indonesia itself? It's home to, 3 of the world's largest choke points. That's the Malacca, Lombok and Sunda Straits.
Yeah, that's right. And so Indonesia is geographically quite important located, but it's not as often discussed in the geopolitical framing regarding contention over the South China Seas, let's say, the way that with the Philippines or Vietnam, this often comes up, and as well as regarding Taiwan. But in terms of this cooperation, I think it's interesting to note how Indonesia is also at the juncture of many of the same influences contesting between the US and China. China is, of course, Indonesia's largest trading partner. And then in emphasizing that is not targeted at China or Russia, Indonesia is then framing itself as, in the sense, I guess you could even say bipartisan, rather than focusing on aligning with the US against China at a time of rising tensions.
Tony, Indonesia is also part of one of the island chains, the second island chain. It's right at the bottom of that. So, what does that give it in terms of strategic, placement?
Well, the straits that you mentioned is important because if Malacca Strait and South China Sea gets blocked by China, then Lombok Strait becomes critical for the United States and Japan and Korea, because the oil will have to go through Lombok Strait.
And understand that that's deep and wide enough to take those
precisely
vessels.
It's one of the straits that's deep enough to allow tankers to go through. So that's the strategic importance, as Brian mentioned, of Indonesia.
Brian, now it's said very specifically in relation to the tensions between China and the Philippines in the South China Sea that it has 3 principles. Firstly, protecting Indonesia's sovereignty. Secondly, protecting Indonesia's territorial integrity, and then maintaining its security. So, if you could tell us about these principles, but in relation to China's assertiveness and China's incursions into Indonesia's own EEZ.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think this is a rising issue for any country in the region. At the same time, this is very much in line with, for example, ASEAN framing itself as not involving itself in disputes in the sense, being non-aligned and respecting sovereignty. And so Indonesia is framing this as its baseline rather than trying to frame itself as, for example, poking China. I think particularly a lot of exercises that take place in the region will be framed by China one way or another. And so for Indonesia to dial back this kind of threat profile, this perception of threat, is something I think it emphasizes quite strongly.
And so you think that that is very strategic in doing that? It is trying to allow space or, sort of create that cover for China that the Philippines is not doing?
I think so. I think particularly with the Philippines, for example, has become a very contested issue regarding the West Philippine Sea, disputed islands and reefs, and etc. I think Indonesia probably does not wish to get involved into that to that extent. It is interesting too. I mean, the history of Indonesia, for example, with regards to China, and particularly under the current administration, that could potentially come as an issue under Prabowo, for example. But I think that particularly trying to avoid getting to the same tensions that, let's say, Philippines has with China, that's probably priority, I think, right now for the government.
And what do you see in terms of the trends of those incursions? Do you see that this strategy is working?
I think it depends. I mean, I don't think that China particularly is focused on Indonesia in that sense. I think particularly there's a lot of stakeholders, and I think China is looking at the overall picture rather than focus on Indonesia per se. It's interesting too, I mean, I think in terms of the cooperation that one has seen between Indonesia and other powers, it's often framed along the lines of, let's say, counterterrorism rather than responding to a Chinese regional threat. Whereas I think with the Philippines or exercises such as the Rim of the Pacific, the element in which it is responding to China, even though it's claimed not to, I think is much more present.
Tony, but on that point, it's interesting that you have experience of being in China and actually seeing, Beijing's claim on essentially Indonesian territory. Can you tell us about that story?
Yeah, in 2005, I had a chance to go to China's Ministry of National Defense, and it's called August 1st Building, Bai Building. And as you walk in, there's a huge engraved map of China. And I remember noticing that night dash line actually went down to the Natuna Island, which belongs to Indonesia. I'm not sure if it's still that way because China is not enforcing that claim right now, although they claim the EEZ north of Natuna, which belongs to Indonesia. But at least at this point, I am not aware of the fact that China is trying to enforcing that claim, just like they're trying to do in the Second Thomas Shoal, for example. So I thought that was interesting. I know they caught my eye.
That has been the location, isn't it, Brian, for plenty of Chinese incursions. And I also understand that, local fishermen there are very wary of China, especially China's Coast Guard, and they, like their Philippine counterparts, have been told to move on and basically leave these waters because they fall within Chinese waters.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it is possible this becomes contentious because I think particularly regarding the lives of everyday people such as fishermen, there's often public outrage. And so it does depend, but I don't think we're at the level of, for example, ships ramming each other in the way of occurs in the Philippines or firing water cannons upon, for example, Philippine vessels that are staking out territorial claims. And I think particularly there's a very strong demand from the public in the Philippines, which perhaps Indonesia may not, or the government may not want to see that because then it is pressured into taking action, perhaps.
And Tony, how would you describe it? Because China is obviously very keen to say that this is as a result of the Philippines' transparency strategy. But as we know, their transparency strategy came out of the increasingly aggressive, assertive moves by China, perhaps starting off, which caught international attention, with the laser, the military-grade laser, and then all the series of things after that.
So China has a very fine line to walk right now. And as Brian pointed out, right now Indonesia tries to downplay this because China is Indonesia's largest trading partner and the largest foreign investment income from. So Indonesia don't want to make it too difficult, but yet if China decides to take the same tactics as they are doing with the Philippines, I suspect the nationalism within Indonesia will push the new president into a more confrontational stance against China. So unfortunately, China with its werewolf diplomacy activities, I wonder if it's ever going to get smart on it and realizing having flexing your strong arm is not necessarily is good for long-term relationship.
And maybe it's also limiting the nations, the number of nations that it's targeting. Maybe it believes that maybe Philippines and Vietnam is enough for the time being.
Could be.
Okay, let's move on to the F-22s, which we mentioned at the top of the show. So the US has deployed 4 and their 5th generation F-22 Raptors across the 3 nations of the South China Sea in July. And the US military has stated that the F-22 is unmatched. So Tony, if you can tell us, what is it about the jet that makes it so lethal, and how does it compare to, say, the F-35 and even China's J-20?
Well, F-22 is truly a very special jet. When I was in the Air Force, I was able to receive some classified briefing. I was able to fly the simulator, the F-22 simulator. So it is designed to dominate the air. And it is stealthy, and it is one of the few aircraft, actually it was the first jet aircraft that can do what we call super cruise. That means go supersonic without using afterburner. When you see a jet fighter with flame shooting out, they're using afterburner. They're dumping raw fuel into the engine to give the extra thrust. But you can't fly like that because it uses too much fuel. But F-22 can, because of its slick design, it can actually do supersonic without using the afterburner dumping the fuel.
So you don't see the trail?
You don't see the flame because it gives out infrared signature. Even you're stealthy and avoid radar, but if you got that big fire behind you, people can still see you. So F-22 also has what we call super maneuverability because its exhaust, the pipe moves up and down so that it can allow the aircraft to do very unnatural things. It makes turns at a very amazing maneuverability. In addition, it's the first aircraft that's based on the net-centric warfare concept where F-22, without opening its own radar, which give out the signature, it can receive outside sources to give it a God's eye view of the battlefield, what aircraft it is, what missile it carries, and what point its radar might be able to see the F-22, but also tells the F-22 at what point you can start shooting. And most of the time you can shoot the missile before the enemy even know you're there. So usually this is a first launch, first kill type scenario.
So how does it compare to the F-35?
F-35 can do all of this also, except super maneuverability and also super cruise. But F-35's difference is F-22 is dominating air. It's a air-to-air. F-35 is multi-role. It does air and ground. It drops bombs. Now, J-20 is also a stealthy aircraft, but its stealthiness is mainly frontal, okay? So when there's other sensors looking from the side, then you can find it. It doesn't look maneuverable because it's long body and big wing. It doesn't really allow it to turn aerodynamically. But who knows? It's an untested aircraft. People really doesn't know. But F-35 is tested. I don't know if you remember last month when Israeli F-35 went over and bombed Iranian embassy in Damascus, Syria. Damascus was surrounded by Russian S-300 and S-400 air defense missiles. The S-400 was operated by the Russian troops there. Not a single missile was fired. They did not know F-35 was...
They didn't detect it.
Yeah, they couldn't detect it because day-to-day F-22 and F-35, we put a thing called Lundberg lens to increase its radar signature. Otherwise, it's really too dangerous. So a lot of people say, oh, we can detect the stealth aircraft, but during wartime, when that thing is removed, the radar signature becomes very small.
Brian, let me bring you in. So, given all that, thank you for the background, Tony, what message do you think the South China Sea deployment sent to Beijing?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is optics because it's a very expensive piece of hardware, of course, and it has very powerful capabilities. And so it is one of those things that particularly, for example, with Taiwan, there's not been a lot of discussion of trying to acquire something so advanced because Taiwan would not have the ability to, for example, afford just maintaining it. And that's one of the challenges actually with the F-22. But I think particularly in terms of the use of aircraft, it's not always just within warfare capability as well. It's actually also the optics.
Okay, Tony, you wanted to, or did you want to ask you a question? China, of course, says that it's destabilizing the region, but do
actually, Brian brought up a good point about expensive to buy, but F-22 is the only aircraft that U.S. Congress has passed the law forbid it from being exported.
Right.
In 1998, the United States Congress passed a law. Initially, the law got passed because Israel wants to buy it. But after congressional members received briefing on the actual capability, they decided we need to protect this capability. And so...
But why can Israel buy F-35s?
F-35 was okay, because F-22, even now, F-22 has capability that's unmatched. And it has some stuff on the aircraft that's way ahead of everybody else.
Okay, top secret. Indonesia has now hosted one of the world's most advanced fighter jets, as we were hearing. The Indonesian Air Force has indicated that this is aimed at enhancing interoperability between Indonesia and the US. There's also the US-led but Indonesia-hosted Garuda exercises. The US Navy SEALs and the Indonesian Navy's Frogman Forces Command have also held a joint training exercise annually since 2022. However, Indonesia has also defense cooperation with China in military education. Officer-student exercises occur where Chinese military officers do join the Indonesian military staff and command school, and senior Indonesian and Chinese officials agreed recently to hold joint military training. Tony, again, how would you characterize Indonesia's military ties with China versus with the US?
Well, Indonesia has very good relationship with the United States, and Indonesia do fly F-16, but they also fly the Russian Su-30s and the Korean F-A-50s and the British aircraft. So they have a mixture. What they're doing is trying to remain non-aligned and try not to pick sides, but they also need to hedge against China's expansion. Their exercise, as we talked about earlier, with the United States involves warfighting, but their exercise with China so far has been humanitarian relief, disaster relief type activities.
And there would need to be that hierarchy, right? Because otherwise the US wouldn't want to share these military secrets with and weapon systems with Indonesia.
Precisely, not just the US, Australia, and other nations, including Korea. So Indonesia, they have a difficult role to play, as we've been discussing. They certainly want to make sure the national security is protected, but yet they cannot pick sides. They don't want to pick sides.
It's probably a balance that China is hoping to change. Would you say that's true?
Absolutely.
Okay, right, let's move on to the next question. The US military is actively strengthening key strategic partnerships around the South China Sea, which experts interpret as an effort to counter and deter China. Former military general and current Indonesian Minister of Defense, Prabowo Subianto, will assume the presidency of Indonesia in October. But back in April, he traveled to Beijing at Xi Jinping's invitation. Brian, let me come to you. So, Prabowo apparently has announced a policy of increasing military presence in remote islands and border areas, and he's also expected to deepen cooperation with Japan and the United States. So do you think, with his presidency, we would see maybe ties with the US really deepening? And do you think there's any opportunity for a kind of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. style turnabout?
It's a very good question. For example, Prabowo is very conscious of developments in the Philippines. His campaign manager was in fact shared with Marcos Jr. And it's quite interesting then. I think he has a military background, so that definitely does come to the fore. However, I think particularly he will hope to balance between the US and China. Even if one sees cooperation between Indonesia and the US strengthen under his presidency, it is also the case that China has strong business ties. The Belt and Road Initiative is very felt in public infrastructure in Indonesia. And there's also a large ethnic Chinese population. It's actually interesting optics that is Prabowo going to China when he is viewed as the general responsible for violence against ethnic Chinese in Indonesia in past decades. And so there's some quite irony, actually, in fact, to his strengthening relations with China.
Tony, do you want to comment on, whether you think, given his background, that he might become more militant against any incursions by China?
I think that's the key. If China takes a strong arm approach, I fully expect China will be receiving the reverse effect against the result they're hoping for. I think Prabowo will also respond very strongly, like Marcos Jr.
Brian, how about Brunei's Brunei, because the F-22 is obviously, or did land for the first time in Brunei. What do we know about Brunei's relationship with China, and also what's its stance in the South China Sea? It's probably the quietest claimant there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think it's a similar dynamic in which Brunei is caught between these larger powers, whether of ASEAN or the US and China, and so tries to hedge bets between them. Brunei is not really in a position to emphasize claims in the South China Seas the way that other countries, more powerful militaries or a geopolitical presence are. Indonesia, for example, is viewed traditionally as the problem solver of ASEAN. Brunei is much smaller and does not have such power in terms of economy or size of population or, in that sense, influence. What it does have is being sometimes a financial hub where people park their money or there's a lot of wealth. But then that is a different story from military presence.
How keen would Beijing be to have access to a military base either in Indonesia or Brunei?
Certainly they would like to, although it's doubtful they will achieve that objective just because they have conflicting claim in the South China Sea. And U.S. and Brunei actually has a very good military relationship. The two countries signed an MOU on defense cooperation in 1994. And when I was in the Air Force, I visited Brunei under that kind of cooperation. Their military is very, very tiny. And so they can't.
Very close to the US?
They are not that close to the US per se, but they're very tiny. So eventually, I think the Sultan realizes he needs to have a strong friend if there's anything going to happen, because
so is the US the security provider? Is it, or too far to go?
It's not officially, but when you look at the F-22 landing in Brunei, for example, what do we do when we do that? When we do that, when we look at the base and say, how is Brunei capable of receiving U.S. forces? We look at the base, look at the fuel storage, look at the runway capability, as far as how many airplanes can be parked, can support, and in case we want to use it for combat operation. That's why we visit all these places. We do assessments just in case there's contingencies. So the fact that Brunei opened up to allow U.S. aircraft to come in, I think there's a hidden meaning there.
So what's the hidden meaning?
The hidden meaning is to make sure that in the future, if China actually try to deny Brunei's legitimate claim of South China Sea, and then maybe just like Philippines right now, hey, we have a big friend next to us, so don't push us around type things. So I'm wondering if the Sultan is thinking in that term, because China has becoming more aggressive. China wasn't this aggressive 10 years ago, but it has become so. So he has to hedge against that.
Right, and then obviously the same being for Indonesia.
Yeah.
Brian, let's go back a bit to Brunei's own claims within the South China Sea. So there are two features that are the main ones within its EEZ. Tell us about Louisa Reef and Rifleman Bank.
Yeah. In particular, I think a lot of the focus for Brunei then is economic in nature. I don't really see, it's not a position, I think, where the nationals and the people would be stoked by that, claiming features of the South China Seas. So if it is there, then it is a claimant, but then it is usually not the one pushing for example, arbitration or in a position to military contest anybody. And
no, but country's EEZ is there under UNCLOS.
Yeah, that's right. So in terms of its own economic zone, it becomes an issue regard to fishermen, for example, regarding just at what distance, for example, you are allowed to fish. And this has come into contention. I think it's still potential for flashpoints with any country, and this is because of the fact that there are Chinese fishermen that operate outside their waters with illegal fishing and so forth. But then it's also another question as to the stakeholder in terms of international fishing. How much you can maintain such claims is often dependent on your geopolitical power, and so Brunei is not necessarily in a position to do that either.
Right. Okay. And so that's why it needs to hedge. Whilst we said that there's strong trade and economic links with China, it also wants to have the U.S.
Precisely, because Brunei Navy has 20 small patrol boats, very small ones. Their Air Force have no fixed-wing fighters. They have helicopters and a couple of fixed-wing propeller trainers. So they don't really have a self-defense force that can go up against any type of Chinese intrusion. So I think they didn't have to worry about it before, but I think they might be worrying about it now.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Tony Hu and Brian Hioe, for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.
At Connected, we believe in the power of dialogue. It's not just about the headlines, it's about finding common ground. Join the conversation.
Connected with Divya Gopalan on Taiwan+.
We bring you stories from Taiwan.
Every day of the week.
Our reporters travel the nation.
Exploring the issues that matter to you.
News from here in Taiwan and around the world.
What's up, Taiwan? On Taiwan+.